Hell has captured the modern imagination, so much so in the modern world religions that it's pretty easy to forget that many ancient traditions didn't have places of punishment in their beliefs, but instead saw death as a dreary and boring affair, or as mediocre but otherwise mostly pleasant. In part 1, we covered how Zoroastrian and Hellenic influences may have shaped these beliefs, and if you missed it, you should definitely check it out in the iCard. But now we venture into the Middle East and Rome. Let's take a look at hell. Kaide. In part 1, I talked at length about Plato and Homer's influences on afterlife beliefs and hinted that Virgil took some inspiration from Plato, and that all three may have influenced some of the developments that led to Christianity and shifts in Jewish thought at the time. Because I'm talking about the history of a living world religion today, I want to give a brief disclaimer. What I'm going to talk about in the sections on Sheol and Gehenna is based on biblical and some rabbinical scholarship on the writings, as well as some archaeological evidence. Though I will admit that the sources that I have access to seem to heavily privilege biblical scholarship, so I haven't been able to look as much into the rabbinical writings on the topic. Judaism is still a living world religion made up of many different traditions that often disagree with one another. Nothing I'm saying here is meant to invalidate any of those traditions or their modern beliefs. I'm going to try and treat this with as much respect as I can, given that I'm looking at the historical development of a hell belief in a tradition that isn't Judaism. But if I make mistakes, let me know down in the comments, because I'm specifically talking about pre-Christian Judaism. I'm going to refer to the deities of those traditions as the Jewish God, as opposed to the Christian God when I begin talking about Christianity. I'm not entirely sure whether they're the same deity or not, but the views of them between the modern traditions are different enough that distinguishing them feels important to me specifically. As a pagan, they very well could be a different deity, though I know the people in those traditions, sometimes Jewish folks seem to think they're different gods, and sometimes they don't. Again, it really varies based off of the person. With that said, this video today is going to be divided into 3 parts. Just like the Muse series, these parts will be numbered after the ones in the first installment, and eventually I may merge all of the videos into the series into a longer one for folks who didn't want to have to hunt down all the individual installments. In part 4, we'll take a look at the ways that Sheol developed and eventually Gehenna evolved from the Iron Age into Roman-era Judaism, as well as the potential influences from surrounding cultures. Then in part 5, we'll deep dive into the Aeneid and Virgil's expansion on Plato's ideas, as we explored in the last installment, to see where Dante got some of his ideas from the famous Divine Comedy. Finally, in part 6, we'll take a look at the namesakes of heaven and hell, which come from the heathen traditions. As always, sources are in the description. If you're new, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and pop a like if you like my work. It really helps out in the algorithm, especially if you're seeing this very close to when it released. If you would like to help support the work I do, link is in the description to my Patreon, though don't feel too much pressure if times are hard at the moment. Without further ado, let's get into it. Part 4, Sheol and Gehenna. One of the first things the aspiring Christian eschatologist will notice when digging into the history of the afterlife, if they happen to look at the text in their original languages, is that the words heaven and hell occur nowhere in the text of the Bible at all. This is a well-known gotcha among anti-theists who enjoy arguing with Christians over afterlife beliefs, but it does beg the question, what words do we find instead? In the books that comprise the so-called New Testament, the words that refer to the afterlife most frequently are Hades, which is by far the more common, and Tartaros, which occurs in Revelation. But what if the books of the so-called Old Testament, many of which comprise the Jewish Tanakh? The words that you find in the afterlife in the pre-Christian bits of the Bible are Sheol and Gehenna. Sheol far predates Gehenna as a potential afterlife concept, though as we'll see, there's a scholarly bar fight ongoing for over a century over whether or not the word was meant as a place or merely as a synonym for the grave and permanent death. In fact, Bart Ehrman, who wrote Heaven and Hell: A History of the Afterlife, goes so far as to claim that there wasn't really even a concept of the soul in Iron Age Judaism, though Theodore Lewis, another prominent scholar on the topic, disagrees vehemently. I'm going to say up front that having read a lot more articles on the topic, bickering over archaeological evidence versus textual evidence, etc., I personally think it looks like a lot of Jewish folks did believe in the afterlife and a soul of some kind, including some of the poets, writers, and prophets who left books that we're looking at behind, but that a lot of the priesthood and the prophets saw those beliefs as against the covenant established by their God at the time the Deuteronomistic writers composed their works. We'll get into who that person might be later. That's just my personal personal opinion, so as always, take it with a grain of salt. The folks fighting over this have devoted their lives to study, and I'm just a pagan YouTuber summarizing their work for you all. Now that we know there are sides, let's take a look at each of them. What Lewis calls the more conservative side, the idea that Iron Age Jewish folks didn't really have an afterlife concept, does have some textual support behind it. Philip Johnston in The Underworld and the Dead, in the Old Testament, argues that scholars have gone too far in attributing words like Eres and Elohim to spirits in the underworld. Elohim, for those curious, is one of the names of the Jewish god in the Old Testament, but it's also used in a story we'll discuss later to refer to the risen spirit of Samuel the prophet. Ehrman tells us that the ancient Israelites didn't really have a concept of immortality for the soul. He tells us that the Hebrew word nefesh, often synonymous with life, is simply life force or breath, rather than a synonym for the soul or psyche found in other traditions like the Greek or the surrounding Babylonian and Ugaritic beliefs. Sheol, which is a term synonymous with death or the grave, occurs over 60 times in the Old Testament, most of which occur in Psalms, though some also show up in the Deuteronomistic books, which, for those who aren't familiar, are Joshua, Judges, both books of Samuel, both books of Kings, along with Deuteronomy. These books are called the former prophets by the modern Hebrew canon. They're thought by many biblical scholars to be assembled together to tell a continuous narrative, perhaps even composed by a single person in their present form, though there is some argument over the veracity of that theory also now. Researching Jewish or Christian history is a minefield filled with disclaimers. Expect a lot more throughout the video. Ehrman points out that much like English poetry rhymes with sounds, ancient Hebrew poetry, like the Psalms, tends to rhyme ideas with repeating synonyms and paired lines. One example he gives is Psalm 2:2-4, where we are told, "The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together, but he who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord has them in derision." The idea rhyming schemes here are kings and rulers set themselves and take counsel, he who sits in the heavens and Lord laughs and has them in derision. Can you see the pairings now? When we look at Sheol in the Psalms, we get repeated references to the grave, the pit, and death. In Psalm 16:10, we're told, "For you did not give me up to Sheol or let your faithful ones see the pit," which clearly is addressed to the Jewish God, where the psalmists tell him that they are faithful and that he shouldn't let them die early. In Psalm 49, we're told that foolish people who don't obey their God, like sheep they are appointed for Sheol, death shall be their shepherd, straight to the grave they descend, Sheol shall be their home. Note how Sheol is echoed by the pit in Psalm 16:10, and how Sheol is compared to a shepherd of death and the grave in Psalm 49. It's pretty clear that the two are synonymous. This is where Theodore Lewis diverges from Bart Ehrman, as he points out in several of his works that archaeological evidence from Jewish grave sites from the Iron Age points to the idea of the afterlife, especially given that many of them contain grave goods like extra changes of clothes, pottery containing remnants of food, and sometimes epitaphs with curses on them warning grave robbers that there wasn't enough treasure there to make it worth their time, but that if they try anyway, a nasty fate awaits them. Why would people who don't believe in an afterlife bury their loved ones with items that wouldn't be useful to them in that non-existent afterlife? Especially clothing. I know modern people are used to fast fashion and cheap clothes, but for the majority of human history, cloth and clothing were extremely valuable, especially for a wandering desert culture like that of Israel. Most people didn't have more than one or two changes of clothes, and well-made textiles would be passed through generations, because the cost of replacing them was really high. If there are 2 articles of clothing in a gravesite, the person was probably wealthy, and their family likely thought they could use the extra clothes somewhere else. But there's evidence beyond this of afterlife belief among common people and the rulership during the Iron Age in the Bible itself. In 1 Samuel 28, we get the story of King Saul's visit to a woman necromancer. He had just kicked out all the sorcerers of his kingdom, but because of prior transgressions against the covenant with the Jewish God, his deity refused to counsel him on the matter of an incoming Philistine invasion. We are told he left during the dead of night in disguise to meet the woman, who reluctantly agrees to help him and summon his dead teacher Samuel when he swears an oath that he will not screw her over if she does. She does the ritual, and when she sees Samuel, she realizes that she's helping King Saul. "Do not be afraid," the king replied. "What do you see?" "I see a god coming up out of the earth," the woman answered. "What does he look like?" asked Saul. "An old man is coming up," she said, "and he's wearing a robe." So Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed face down in reverence. Samuel proceeds to tell Saul off for his indiscretions and announce that his kingdom is going to be handed to the young upstart David, but I'd like to draw your attention to 2 major issues with the idea that the Israelites at the time had no afterlife beliefs or concept of the soul. First, the author of Samuel doesn't even pretend that the ritual didn't work. It definitely did, and the word used for God there describes the spirit of Samuel and is the aforementioned Elohim from earlier. Second, why would necromancers and the like be finding business in Israel at the time if there were no afterlife beliefs are tomb cults. Although I know that there were other peoples who lived in those lands at the time, there are several passages throughout the Deuteronomistic books that specifically bar sorcery and burial and mourning practices like smearing ashes on their faces or tearing out their hair or wearing sackcloth, practices that we know are common in other Semitic traditions at the time. Why would the authors and the prophets tell people to stop doing something they already weren't doing? Where's the sense in that? There's also another odd incident in 2 Kings that we should probably look at. Now, the Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders, so they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came back to life and stood on his feet. 2 Kings 20-1. Now, in order to understand why this is weird, it's important to know how polluting human remains were considered by the Jewish people back then. Elaborate purification that could last up to a week were recorded in the Bible for coming into contact with bones, and at least in one passage, we're told that human remains could be used to pollute pagan altars and break their power. So the idea of a prophet's bones somehow bringing a man back to life seems in stark contrast to that, especially if there's no soul to leave power in said bones. Also, it's the only story in the entire Bible that's anything like that, and Elisha as a prophet was said to be able to heal people and bring back the dead as part of his prophet powers. Which brings us back to the theory of Sheol as a place. What would it be like? Sheol is described as watery in the book of Jonah, as having bars or gates in several passages throughout the Old Testament. In Sirach, we're told that no one can sing the praises of God in Sheol, and in Isaiah 38:18, we're told that in Sheol no one can access their God. Sheol was personified so often that some scholars think that it was once seen as a deity like the underworld deities of neighboring nations. At least one paper on the topic is accessible from JSOR with a subscription and is linked in the description if you have one. It's a fascinating discussion. One important thing to note, we see no differentiation in the Iron Age literature between the righteous and the wicked, apart from, as Lewis points out, the lives of the wicked being cut short as punishment by their god. In fact, through most of the Bible, with the exception of Chronicles, we usually don't get exact lifespans when people's deaths are discussed. Instead, we get descriptions like live to a ripe old age or cut short in years. This starts to shift during the Roman persecution of Jewish folks in the 2nd century BCE, when Sheol becomes synonymous with a holding place for the wicked and the idea of eternal reward for those martyred by the Romans, which starts to take shape in Judaism. We begin to see stories of a Satan, or adversary, which in Job starts off as one of the Jewish gods' divine counselors, opposed to humanity but still subservient to their deity. Note that we still don't quite get the idea of eternal punishment during this period, but we do start to see ideas of resurrection and punishment after resurrection for those who oppose their god's will during their lives. One book, the first apocryphal book of Enoch, was thought to be composed by 5 different writers at different periods and assembled into a whole, details some of the first apocalyptic ideas in Jewish thought. It's here where we get details on the Nephilim beyond what was mentioned in Genesis, as well as some of the early ideas about rewards and punishments in the afterlife. In chapter 22, the angel Raphael takes the narrator, claiming to be Enoch, to a room with 4 chambers. One contains the souls of righteous people which will be raised from the dead on a coming judgment day. One contains the souls of sinners who didn't get punishments while alive. They're going to be assigned torment after judgment day to pay for their crimes. The third contains people who weren't as bad or as good as the first 2 and were murdered by sinners. Their rewards and punishments aren't specified, but they're implied to be not as bad as the second room. The last section contains sinners who received punishment during life. They won't be raised for punishment or disruption on judgment day. They'll just be stuck in the unpleasant room for eternity. It's here we also get a mention of the Valley of Gehenna, which is actually the Greek name for the Valley of Hinnom, as a place of punishment and fire for the wicked. Gehenna was an actual valley where corpses and garbage were burned by various cultures, a literal garbage dump that seemed like it was always burning with refuse. Enoch tells us that the fires will leap out of the earth to consume the wicked in Gehenna, which had previously been referred to as the place where corpses were buried and pagan gods were worshipped previously in the text. We need to take a brief break to explain another set of texts in Judaism, the Talmud. The Talmud is a series of texts containing the oral laws and additional commentary on various holy books, grouped together into 3 sections: the Mishnah, the Gemara, and a third set of auxiliary commentaries. In the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin, we're told that Gehenna extends all the way into the center of the world. In later commentaries, we're told that Gehenna as a valley was seen as a refuse heap, and the idea became that the souls of sinners would be tossed upon the refuse heap to burn, or that their bodies, depending on which view you take regarding whether or not souls were a concept in ancient Judaism. I'm going to again caution against seeing any ancient tradition as a monolith. There were likely as much of a plurality of ancient views on the subject as there are within modern Jewish traditions. The Book of Daniel picks up where First Enoch leaves off in our history. Scholars have dated it back to the 2nd century BCE during the revolt against the Romans started by the Maccabees, against the attempts by Rome to stop Jewish folks from circumcising their kids and following kosher food standards, among among other things. The story is of Daniel resisting the Babylonian domination that mirrored the restrictions of the Romans at the time, and ends with 6 chapters of apocalyptic visions of massive catastrophes for a dominating empire and the triumph of their god over the forces of evil. The non-canonical text Psalms of Solomon, as opposed to Song of Solomon, details a resurrection of the body, with utter destruction for those deemed sinners, with eternal life in the light of their God for the righteous. This is a bit earlier than the previous works, though its lack of canonicity makes it only useful for mentioning that these ideas were present and received more development under Roman oppression. This is also where the idea of a Messiah, quite different than the Christian conception, began to develop. A great Jewish leader who would rally the troops of the Israelites and throw off the shackles of the Romans to restore the rule of Jewish people of Israel and to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. This is part of why Jewish people at the time didn't accept Jesus as a Messiah. He was kind of the opposite of everything that they thought a Messiah would be. I'm not saying whether or not he was. Again, Jewish people very clearly didn't think that he was, and a faction of them and a whole heck of a lot of Greeks and Romans seemed to think that he was, in fact, this figure. However, it's interesting to state that despite Christian claims that there are lots and lots of portents for Jesus all throughout the Old Testament, you really actually don't really see that many unless you're trying to take a whole lot of quotes out of contexts. Anyway, it's pretty clear for a good chunk of Jewish history, rewards and punishments were thought to be doled out during life, either way, and under the oppression by the Romans, this shifted towards rewards and punishments in the afterlife, which makes sense when it looks like a whole bunch of people are torturing you and they're getting away with it scot-free and you're wondering about divine justice and how it'll be metered out. But we're not done yet, because many of the modern images of hell we're familiar with still come from other sources. For example, the Aeneid. Part 5. Virgil's influence. The Aeneid is sometimes called the founding myth of Rome, and for good reason. It is as frequently read and cited by the Roman gentry as the Iliad and the Odyssey were among the learned Greeks. What's most interesting is that many scholars caution that the afterlife beliefs as relayed in Book 6 were heavily influenced by Plato and may not have reflected the beliefs of the majority of Romans, though it did likely reflect some of the beliefs of the Roman gentry through a good chunk of the Roman period prior to the domination of Christianity in later Roman history. The underworld descent tale starts with Aeneas receiving an assignment from the Cumaean Sibyl to descend into the underworld and visit the spirit of his dead father. In order to come back, however, he needs to receive a sign, a golden branch, which should tear easily from the tree it's on if he's meant to go. At first, he's extremely upset because of the massive, overwhelming size of the forest, but then he prays to the gods for help, and they send doves which perch on the correct tree and grant him his blessing. Then, he and his men make busy preparing the black cattle and other requirements for entry into the underworld. As per usual, the Roman afterlife descent is both more bombastic and more detailed than Homer's, as is the ritual to allow entrance into the underworld. But what's interesting is how Virgil builds on many of the ideas in Plato. Virgil opens their descent after the ritual with a gaggle of guardian monsters. In the midst of an elm, shadowy and vast, spreads her bows and aged arms, the whom, which, men say, false dreams hold, clinging under every leaf, and many monstrous forms, besides of various beasts, are stalled at the doors, centaurs, double-shaped Scyllas, and the hundredfold Briareos, and the beast of Lerna, hissing horribly, and the Chimera, armed with flame, Gorgons and Harpies, and the shape of the three-bodied shade Geryon. Here on a sudden, in trembling terror, Aeneas grasps his sword, and turns the naked edge against their coming. And did not his wise companion warn him that these were but faint bodiless lives, flitting under a hollow semblance of form, he would rush upon them and vainly cleave shadows with steel. Although the Gorgons and Kerberos are said to be in the underworld by the poets, we don't have any fragments to my knowledge that place these other monsters there specifically from epic poetry specifically prior to Virgil, though I think there are some plays who may mention their presence there. He tells us at the end there that the shades of the monsters are insubstantial to the heroes as the shades of humans were to Odysseus in Odyssey 11. Shortly after the monsters, we come upon Acheron. Virgil breaks from Plato by connecting Acheron to Cocytus, the river of murderers from Plato's work, and also describes Cocytus as muddy, where Plato called it the bluest blue of blues. At the shores, we meet Charon, the fabled boatman of the underworld, and find, just as Odysseus did, that the unburied cannot access the river, though in the Odyssey, they are stuck just outside the underworld rather than at the shores of the river. And as we know from my video on necromancy, link in the iCard if you missed it, sometimes these ghosts wouldn't end up in the underworld at all, but instead stuck around to make trouble for the living. Charon initially tells the group that he can't carry living bodies on his boat, and that he hated having to do it for previous heroes at the behest of the gods. The soothsayer with them then offers him the golden bow that they got earlier, and he calms down and allows them passage, all the way to Kerberos, who the seer drugs with meat that had been laced with a sedative mixed with honey. Thus begins our journey into the ninefold circles of Tartaros. Yes, I said 9. You'll notice just how much Dante cribbed off of Virgil as we get along. Many are familiar with the Divine Comedy, but I've noticed just how few have mentioned the influence of the Aeneid, despite the sheer amount of Virgil simping thing Dante did in the Divine Comedy's Inferno portion. We'll talk about him and the context of his work in a later video, but it's important to draw the connection here so y'all can remember it for reference later. The first polar souls that we encounter are infants who died before their naming day or before growing into toddlers, crying for their mothers alongside those condemned to die for crimes that they didn't commit. Like Plato, Virgil mentions that King Minos sentenced them to linger in the outermost circle for eternity as a judge, with no pity for their poor fate. Quick trigger warning for mentions of self-harm. This ring is also home to those who ended their lives prematurely by their own hands prior to getting married, at least the ones who didn't become ghosts anyhow. Our next stop is the mourning fields. Virgil tells us that those consumed by the passion of love, which remember to the Greeks and Romans they thought of as a torturous illness as much as a blessing from the gods, continue to mourn their unrequited or lost loved ones for eternity. Aeneas runs into Queen Dido, a formal lover of his, mourning him despite the presence of her husband. He attempts to console her, but she turns away from him, mirroring the bitterness of Aias against Odysseus in the Odyssey, and her husband consoles her. One major difference between Virgil and Dante is that Dante makes all 9 circles of the underworld torment and separates heaven as being in the clouds, with Platonic sphere planets representing the various areas in heaven. Virgil instead divides the rings between Tartaros and Elysium, with a middle region for the renowned Mordred before the path splits into Elysium and Tartaros. Everywhere we've been up until this point has been outside the rings. This is our next stop, and Aeneas sees a number of his comrades there as well as his enemies. In fact, Agamemnon's battalions flee at the sight of him, trying to get their ships in a mirror of what they had done during the life when facing up against Aeneas. He splits off into the left-hand path and sees Tisiphone, one of the Furies, guarding the gates. Virgil reminds us of those who have offended the gods as listed in Homer and their punishments, but then gets into a number of very specific crimes that he also thought would land someone in the fiery depths, through the mouth of the Sibyl. This is a long passage, but bear with me. Here were they who in a lifetime hated their brethren, or who smote a sire and entangled a client in wrong, or who brooded in solitude over wealth that they had won, nor set aside a portion for their kin. The largest number, this, who were slain for adultery, or who followed the standard of treason and feared not to break allegiance with their lords. All these immured await their doom. Seek not to learn that doom, or what form of crime or fate overwhelmed them. Some roll a huge stone, or hang outstretched on spokes or wheels. Hapless Theseus sits and evermore shall sit, and Phlegyas, most unblessed, gives warning to all with the loud voice that bears witness amid the gloom. Be warned, learn ye to be just and not to slight the gods. This one sold his country for gold and fastened on her a tyrant lord. He made and unmade the laws for a bribe. This forced a daughter's bed, marriage forbidden. All dared a monstrous sin, and what they dared attained. Nay, had I 100 tongues, 100 mouths, and a voice of iron, I could not sum up all the forms of crime, or rehearse all tale of torments. Clearly, the gods were seen by Virgil as having far more concern about smaller matters than the Greek poets did. It's important to point out here that Virgil's text, though popular among the gentry, doesn't represent a monolith in thought among the Romans any more than Hesiod and Homer did among the Greeks. There were still local beliefs and varying degrees of adoption of ideas from mystery cults, which blossomed in popularity during the Hellenistic and Roman eras despite attempts at Roman intervention. However, it's obvious how these images shaped what we now see as hell in many modern world religions. The Sibyl rushes Aeneas away as she says that night is approaching, and they head over to the blissful groves, i.e. the fields of Elysium. We're told that Elysium has its own sun, with the rosy light of the dawn gracing the area, and that there are also stars there as well that are separate from those over the earth. People there wrestle, sing, dance, celebrate, and Orpheus is acknowledged as composing music based on their celebrations. Interestingly, the dead also feast and have access to horses and chariots, and are said to be singing a paean, which is both an epithet of Apollon and also a style of music typically only composed as praises to the gods, usually Apollon and Artemis. See my video on music and initiation in the iCard for more on ancient music and its connections to worship. Virgil tells us that those in the fields number not just the initiated, but also those who suffered wounds in battle for their country and lived, priests who didn't break their oaths and served the gods, bards who composed songs for Apollon, and those artists who are so divinely inspired and skilled that they were remembered after their deaths for said art. He very much stresses that it's only the good artists that made it in. Like, it's very plain. Instead of the rose garland of Sappho, Virgil gives these poets headbands that are white as snow. He puts Musaeus, a poet that we only have fragments of now, but whose works were often held alongside Homer and Hesiod in antiquity, at the center of them. At last, Aeneas meets his father in a green veil, and mirroring Odysseus and his mother, tries to hug him but can't, as shades are insubstantial. Given the wrestling and feasting and music playing though, apparently they can interact with underworld stuff, just not living bodies. Aeneas spots the Lethe, a river not mentioned by Plato but often mentioned in connection with various Orphic sects, and he's told by his father that it's a river for forgetfulness and that the people crowding its edges are owed a second life by the fates. Aeneas can't understand why the sage would want to live again so badly, so his father explains. This is a long quote, but I can't sum it up better than the original text, so bear with me a second time. First, know that heaven and earth and the watery plains, the moon's bright sphere, and Titan's star star, a spirit within sustains. In all limbs, mind moves the mass and mingles with the mighty frame. Thence springs the races of man and beast, the life of winged creatures, and the monsters that ocean bears beneath his marble surface. Fiery is the vigor, and divine the source of those seeds of life, so far as harmful bodies clog them not, or earthly limbs and frames born but to die. Hence their fears and desires, their griefs and joys, nor do they discern the heavenly light, penned as they are in the gloom and their dark dungeon. Still more, when a life's last ray has fled, the wretches are not entirely freed from all evil and all plagues of the body. It needs must that many are a taint long ingrained, should in wondrous wise become deeply rooted in their being. Therefore are they schooled with punishments and pay penance for bygone sins. Some are hung stretched out in the empty winds, from others the stain of guilt is washed away under swirling floods, or burned out by fire, till length of days, when time's cycle is complete, has removed the inbred taint and leaves unsoiled the ethereal sense and pure flame of spirit. Each of us undergoes by his own purgatory. Then we are sent to spacious Elysium, a few of us to possess the blissful fields. All these that you see, when they have rolled time's wheel through 1,000 years, the god summons in vast throng to Lethe's river, so that their memories effaced, they may once more revisit the vault above and conceive the desire to return to the body. The rest of Chapter 6 is mostly pro-war Roman propaganda, listing a number of historical figures as being awesome, Roman, and awesomely Roman. Then Aeneas takes his leave, noting that 2 gates of sleep at the edge of the realm, one of which is said to be an exit for shades to visit their loved ones, the other which sends false dreams that contain no real prophecy. All in all, it's a fascinating trip through the underworld that combines elements of Plato and the poets with a distinctly Roman flair. We get a little more about the specific causes of punishments through Virgil, though again, the Sibyl cops out just as Plato did on the total number of discretions that could land you in Tartaros. Still, what we do get paints a picture of gods far more concerned with individual actions in a worshipper's daily life than the gods described by the Greek poets. Comparatively few virtuous things could land someone in Elysium by his reckoning. Note that he never mentions initiation into a mystery tradition, only kinds of service to the gods and to the state. This is a development from Plato's ideas that your deeds in life landed you your place in the afterlife. The majority of the positions that could get you into Elysium also seem to be circumstances of birth, those who could become poets or priests, which in those times had a lot to do with wealth and access to education due to said wealth, or those with great skill in war who got wounded and survived. The majority of the dead listed in the fields were war dead, with only a brief mention to the poets. Again, very Roman. So is the Roman propaganda at the end. Given that Dante wrote anti-Catholic propaganda himself after the church excommunicated him, I can see why he took inspiration there. But we're still not through the pagan influences on eventual Christian thought, because before we get into the early Christian writings, it might be good to get through the etymology and history behind the modern names, because heaven and hell come from Old English and Norse, though the realms described look quite different. Part 6. Hel and Hjofen. If you didn't notice from the spelling, the original words for heaven and hell are the Old Norse term hel with one L and the Old English Hjofen. The former described the afterlife of the goddess of the same name, Helheim, or the realm of hell, where the latter was the Old English name for heaven. I'm going to state this up front. No, the majority of people were not thought to go to Valhalla in ancient Norse society. That was reserved for warriors who died in battle and were chose specifically for such. The majority of the dead were said to go to Hell's realm, Helheim. As several of the heathen content creators have noted over the years, the sources on Helheim and the goddess are scant and contradictory. Much like with Sheol, there seems to be a debate among scholars as to whether or not Hel was worshipped as a goddess in pre-Christian times, or if she was a later personification of an afterlife realm that they already believed in. Note, I am not denying the reality of the goddess for anybody who worships her. I'm simply discussing the varying opinions of the scholars that I read while researching this section. The etymology of Hel, thought by Christopher Abram in his paper on the goddess in Viking and medieval Scandinavia in Volume 2, was said to be Helon, which means to cover or hide, which is similar to the etymology for Hydes, which is thought by some scholars to emerge from plus Edain, or unseen. According to Abram, the primary evidence for the existence of the goddess comes exclusively from poetry and other literary works. There's no real evidence in the burial customs or in funerary epitaphs during the Viking Age that she was honored at burial. I was told that there might be a more modern find that may be an image depicting her, but there's a lot of debate among scholars as to whether or not that is, and there's no runic label on it to tell us which goddess it is. The place and the goddess show up in both skaldic and Eddic poetry, as well as Eddic prose, and the evidence for her as a goddess is scant in the Eddic works, so that's what we're going to be looking at first. I'm not going to pretend that I can do as thorough of a coverage of both concepts as a well-read heathen could, but it's important to give at least an overview for the purposes of this series to discuss the differences between the realm of Helheim and the realm that modern folks would call the Christian Hell in the Christian imagination. Hell is referenced in the Grimnismal as living under one of the 3 roots of Yggdrasil. 3 roots grow in 3 directions under the ash of Yggdrasil. Hell lives under one, the frost giants under the second, and the third humankind. In another Eddic poem, the Voluspa, we get another line that tells us a bit more about her realm. Golden crone crowned for the Aesir, he wakes the warriors at the Father of Hosts' dwelling, and another crows down the blow the earth, a sooty red cock in the halls of hell. As this cock is crowing, we can assume it means a male chicken. Get your hat out of the gutter. Anyway, we find out that her realm is underground, and that the halls of hell refers to the goddess as it's contrasted by the realm which belongs to Odin. According to Abram, there aren't any more lines that unambiguously denote hell as a goddess in the Poetic Eddas, though there are many that could be either the goddess or the realm. It doesn't surprise me that there aren't a ton of references to her. It seems in line with the way that the Greeks treated Hyades, usually with an epithet or just referring to his realm so as not to attract his attention. Also, as we'll see, there are references to her existence across 3 separate cultures, 2 language families, and hundreds of years. The Danes, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Icelanders all have some mention of her in her realm, so the idea that she wasn't honored seems strange to me, despite the scholars claiming that. I suppose if we had more surviving, it would be a similar situation to Hyades, but we don't, so here we are. While we're on the topic of Eddic poetry, let's take a look at a few of the lines that tell us what hell the realm is like according to the authors of the Eddas. Back to the Grimnis Mál, we are told that there are rivers that flow from the earth to hell in a description of rivers in stanza 28. Vina, one is called, the second Vegswin, a third Theothnuma, Nit and Not, Non and Hron and Hrith, Silgur and Ilgur, Vith and Van, Vond and Strond, Gil and Leipter, they fall close to men and flow from here to hell. The majority of the rest of the instances in the Poetic Eddas repeat information that we already have from these. Hell is underground, the realm of the dead has a hall or halls, and can be reached through specific paths. At one point, Odin is said to journey to hell in Baldur's Dromar, but interestingly, nowhere does he encounter the goddess, though he is said to encounter a dog at the entrance, reminiscent of Kerberos at the entrance to Hyades. If we shift to the much later Prose Edda, we get a much more detailed picture of Hell's appearance and her realm. She is referred to as a daughter of Loki, and her aspects and domains are described in some detail. Yet more children had Loki. Angerbonda was the name of a certain giantess in Jotunheim, with whom Loki got 3 children. One was Fenriswolf, the second Jormungandr, that is the Midgard serpent, and the third is Hel. But when the gods learned that his kindred was nourished in Jotunheim, and when the gods perceived by prophecy that from this kindred a great misfortune should befall them, and since it seemed to all that there was a great prospect of ill, first from the mother's blood and yet worse from the father's, then the All-Father sent gods thither to take the children and bring them to him. When they came to him, straightway he cast the serpent into the deep sea, where he lies about all the land, and the serpent grew so greatly that he lies in the midst of the ocean encompassing all the land and bites upon his own tail. Hel he cast into Niflheim and gave to her power over 9 worlds, to apportion all abodes among those who were sent to her, that is, men dead of sickness or old age. She has great possessions there, her walls are exceedingly high and her gates great. Her hall is called Sleet Cold, her dish Hunger, Famine is her knife, Idler her thrall, Slavin her maidservant, Pit of Stumbling her threshold, by which one enters, Disease her bed, Gleaming Bale her bed hangings. She is half blue-black and half flesh color, by which she is eagerly recognized, and very lowering and fierce. Interesting that she is described as half blue-black and half fleshy. This implies that, like Persephone, she has some dominion over the living, i.e. the flesh half, and the dead, the blue-black part. Later, Hel is discussed a bit again when the gods are upset that Baldur has been killed unbeknownst to them at that point by Loki, and Hermodr makes a journey to Hel's realm in the hopes that she might let Baldur go with a bargain of some kind. Then Hermodr rode on until he came to the Hel Gate. He dismounted from his steed and made his girths fast, mounted and pricked him with his spears, and the steed leaped so hard over the gate that he came nowise near to it. Then Hermodr rode home to the hall and dismounted from his steed, went into the hall and saw sitting there in the high seat Baldur and his brother, and Hermodr tarried there overnight. At morn Hermodr prayed to Hel that Baldur might ride home with him, and told her how great the reaping was among the Aesir. But Hel said that in this wise it should be put to the test whether Baldur were so all-beloved as had been said. If all things in this world, quick and dead, weep for him, then he shall go back to the Aesir, but he shall remain with Hel if any gainsay it or will not weep. Then Hermodr arose, but Baldur led him out of the hall, and took the ring Draupnir, and sent it to Odin for remembrance. And Nanna sent Frigg a linen smock, and yet more gifts, and to Fulla a golden finger ring. Loki sabotages this by transforming into a woman and refusing to weep, by the way, so Baldur doesn't get out. Just before this, we have a reference to the Hel ways that allow Hermodr to even go there in the first place, the idea of rooms in a vast hall with Baldur sitting at a specific seat, that Hermodr had to cross a bridge before going a river to get there, and was questioned before he was let in, but beyond that we don't get much in the way of a description of the realm. It it did take 9 days of writing to get there, so we do know that much. Where the Icelandic Eddas portray Hel and her realm as potentially dismal, calling it cold, and describing most of the pestilences of man as being either weapons or companions of hers, the Danish Gesta Danorum portrays her realm as sunny, lush, and altogether a more pleasant place. In one of the stories in a book regarding Hatting, one of the Danish kings, we get a brief picture of the afterlife when Hatting is visited by a thin, wrinkled woman bearing hemlock in the middle of winter. Another long passage, but bear with me. When Hatting was sojourning with her, a marvelous portent befell him. While he was at supper, a woman bearing hemlocks was seen to raise her head beside the brazier and, stretching out the lap of her robe, seemed to ask in what part of the world would such fresh herbs had grown in winter. The king desired to know, and wrapping him in her mantle, she drew him with her underground and vanished. I take it that the nether gods purposed that he should pay a visit in the flesh to the regions whither he must go when he died. So first they pierced through a certain dark misty cloud, but advancing along a path that was worn away with long furrow-faring, they came behind certain men wearing rich robes and nobles clad in purple. These they passed, then they at last approached the sunny regions which produced the herbs the woman had brought away. Going further, they came on a swift and tumbling river of leaden waters, whirling down on its rapid currents divers sorts of missiles, and likewise made passable by a bridge. When they had crossed this, they beheld two armies encountering one another with might and main. And when Hatting inquired of the woman about their estate, these, she said, are they who, having been slain by the sword, declare the manner of their death by a continual rehearsal, and enact the deeds of their past life in a living spectacle. Then a wall hard to approach and to climb blocked their further advance. The woman tried to leap it, but in vain, being unable to do so even with her slender wrinkled body. Thus she wrung off the head of a cock which she chanced to be taking down with her, and flung it beyond the barrier of the walls, and forthwith the bird came back to life again, testified by a loud crow to the recovery of its breathing. Then Hatting turned back and began to make homewards with his wife. Some rovers bore down on him, but by swift sailing he baffled their snares, for though it was almost the same wind that helped both, they were behind him as he clove the billows, and, as they had only just as much sail, could not overtake him. In this portrayal, Hel can freely walk between the realms, and her realm is sunny, lush, and separated by both a bridge and a massive wall. Also, she can apparently just bring birds and other creatures back to life if she wants to show off. There's a peculiar passage in the Christian writing known as the Bartholomew Saga, where the Queen of Hel is referred to as a devil with healing powers. Being Christian, of course, she's portrayed as a villain and ruling over Hell with 2 L's, but it's interesting that she was said to have real healing powers which she used to gain worship from followers, similar to the healing and resurrection of the chicken from Gesta Danorum. All in all, neither the Icelandic nor Danish variant on Hel with a single L looks anything like the Christian variation. Virgil's Tartaros is getting there, but we still have a few more stops on our road to the origins. For now, thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, throw the subscribe button's head over a wall and send the like to the trash heap. Drop down into the comments and let me know what you found interesting or learned, or if I got something wrong, let me know that as well. We're only human after all. Special thanks also to my patrons. Times have gotten harder in recent years, and despite that, many of you have supported me for upwards of a year. I barely make enough to keep the channel afloat, and because of you all, I know for a fact I can at least afford the monthly bills for things like my stock footage, the Adobe Suite that I use to edit, and the research materials that I need for videos like this. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.